Live from Washington, D.C., Jay Sekulow Live. Phone lines are open for your questions right now. And now, Chief Counsel for the American Center for Law and Justice, Jay Sekulow.
Welcome again to the broadcast, everyone. This is day 3 of our coverage of the case of Pastor Andrew Brunson in Turkey. We know that the hearing has been now delayed until May 7th. We had the first day of the hearing. The second day of the hearing is about to start scheduled for May 7th. We have about 3 weeks, a little less than that, to get witnesses together, and our team here in the United States is actually, CC Heil, our senior counsel, is actually working on obtaining almost a dozen witness statements for the defense. Now, we're understanding, again, it's a sham trial. This isn't reality, but we've got to put the evidence up because that helps us on the diplomatic front. But the reality is you've got almost a dozen witnesses from, it's far from Turkey to the United States to Australia, all over the globe, that we're trying to coordinate for the defense here. But here's the problem. The problem is that the Turks have really doubled down on this, and we have to understand the sham trial, even though it's a sham, we have to be fully prepared. So in the next couple of weeks, you're not going to be hearing a lot from us on this as we're preparing this next phase of the case. But I want you to know that we're working here at the American Center for Law and Justice. But we've reached, we've reached a critical crossroads here on this case. Now we think that on May 7th, the testimony of the defense, that would be our case, will go forward. Is that what are they done with their witnesses?
They're not done with their witnesses. And in fact, they actually had a second day scheduled for the trial, but they didn't go through with that. So although, again, we are told that May 7th will be the day that we can start our defense, it could be that they'll bring their witnesses again and we'll finish with their witnesses. We don't know. But we have to be prepared and are prepared that it'll be our chance to put on witnesses and to discredit their secret witnesses.
This is a sham of such significant proportion that it almost feels like the world is being duped, okay? Because you've got nations of the world that are allowing this to go on. Now, having said that, you don't have military options here, but the diplomatic options have to be taken, Andy, to an entirely different level.
Well, they do, Jay, and I think your quotation from Disraeli is right. Diplomacy is the art of getting things done without warfare, and I'm not advocating, and I don't think any of us advocate warfare in this case, but what we are advocating is to the Turks, become a humane nation if you can possibly do that, and I know it overcomes a lot of your history to do that. Become a nation that is humane and understanding. You don't have a hostage charging him with, and I'm looking at the crime, Jay, and I'm looking at the indictment. You know what the crime is? The crime they're charging, and I'm quoting from the indictment, political or military espionage.
Yeah.
Spying, espionage, undermining the Turkish Republic, trying to break it apart. A man who has devoted his life for 23 years to doing this horrible thing. Christianization. Yeah. What a horrible thing that he did in the land of St. Paul.
So, yeah, Than, let's talk about what we've been to the UN on this a couple of different, I think 3 times now. What is your sense of what the next move is?
I really think the next move that will make a difference, Jay, comes on an international level. You've established very well that this is now a political game for Turkey, but the price is currently being paid by an innocent American pastor. We have to turn the tables and make sure that the political price for that game now is inflicted on Turkey. The way you do that, you exert U.S. pressure through sanctions and other measures, but, Jay, you also engage the international community, the countries around the world that will stand with the United States and not tolerate this. Jay, it has to become politically untenable for Turkey to keep this ruse up. Until that happens, they're going to continue behaving as it is. We can get into some of the details on this, but Jay, if you're going to do that, you need a Secretary of State and you need ambassadors in countries who will ally with you. We don't have a couple of those right now.
This is a critical situation on that, too. Germany, who's got an influence, as you saw, on this, has been able to, in a very significant way, and I think very significantly, put pressure on the Turkish government to get their journalists released. We don't have an ambassador confirmed to Germany. He's sitting on the floor of the United States Senate. Let's get this done. We don't have the option of not getting it done. So again, we go into witness preparation mode effective to, well, we've been in it, but now really we've got 3 weeks to get these 12 witnesses lined up. So we encourage you to be in prayer for our legal team, but more important, be in prayer for this pastor and for those involved. We'll be back with more in just a moment.
There's been a very troubling development in the trial of Pastor Andrew Brunson in Turkey. As you know, Pastor Brunson's on trial facing charges of Christianization, on trial for simply living out his Christian faith. After hearing testimony, including accusations from unidentified and secret witnesses designed to discredit Pastor Brunson, the judge in the case said the trial would continue on May 7th and ordered Pastor Brunson to be taken back to prison. Instead of being returned to the prison where he had been held most recently, though, the judge ordered Pastor Brunson to be taken back to an extremely overcrowded prison where he was held initially. As you can imagine, the news is devastating to Pastor Brunson and his family. At the ACLJ, we're stepping up our aggressive campaign to secure the freedom of Pastor Brunson. Between now and the next court date of May 7th, we have a critical opportunity to turn up the pressure on the Turkish government. Add your name to our petition right now, aclj.org.
Hey, welcome back to the broadcast, everyone. We're talking about the situation with Pastor Andrew Brunson. Now the next trial date is May 7th, or at least that's what's planned. We're working on witness preparation right now, as I told you. We mentioned on the broadcast yesterday, Ambassador Brownback, who's the ambassador at large for religious freedom, Senator Tillis, were in the courtroom in Turkey when the day one of the proceeding happened. Now, it's not like the United States where you have day one, then day two. Here you have day one, and then it's 3 weeks later you have day two. That's what we're dealing with. But also on the reality that we have and what we're dealing with is the fact that there's a diplomatic component, but there's also the reality is there is a political component to this, and I think we have to be clear on that. Than, the politics of this are pretty significant, but we are trying to get this up to the next level, so to speak.
I'm actually holding up a letter that it just actually last February, 78 members of the House and Senate side, Senator Langford was key in that. He's actually been over to Turkey as well to engage on this case, been personally involved with the family. But I would just tell you this, Jay, just very simply put, Turkey has now made this a political and diplomatic effort. So our response has to be political and diplomatic. We have to respond in like fashion and make sure that we engage them on that level.
All right, so let's set the stage, because a lot of people have been asking about why can't we send in a military strike force? First of all, they're a NATO ally, but I've got our senior military analyst, Wes Smith, in the studio here with us. So Wes, let's talk about the strategic issues involving Turkey as it relates to NATO and the United States.
Right. It would be unthinkable and actually a violation of NATO's charter for a member of NATO to take any kind of military action against another member. And yet, let's be very clear here. Andrew Brunson is not a prisoner. He's not a detainee. He is a hostage. This is behavior much like Iran and North Korea. We expect it from them. But the idea that a NATO country would take a citizen of another NATO country and hold them hostage is unimaginable. Can you imagine Belgium or France or Germany taking a U.S. citizen hostage, or us taking one of their citizens hostage? It simply is inconceivable.
You know, we spoke to Jacqueline, who's the daughter of Andrew Brunson. You've been asking us diplomatically what we've done. We've taken it to the UN Human Rights Council, and Jacqueline actually testified before the Human Rights Council. Let's go ahead and play that.
I pass the floor to European Center for Law and Justice.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm here today on behalf of the ECLJ, who is representing my father, Pastor Andrew Brunson, the innocent United States citizen who has been wrongfully imprisoned in Turkey now for almost a year and a half, and yet he has still not been formally charged with any crime. Having grown up in Turkey, it has been hard for me to understand the situation. My family loves and respects the Turkish people, and my father has been dedicated to serving them for over 2 decades. I know the allegations against him are absurd. He is not an armed terrorist trying to overthrow any government. My father is a peaceful pastor. My family has suffered greatly during the past year and a half, which has been filled with tears and countless unanswered questions. I visited my father last August, and we sobbed the entire visit. It was hard to see him so broken, so thin, so desperate. He wrote a note last week which said, "Let it be clear, I am in prison not for anything I have done wrong, but because of who I am, a Christian pastor. I desperately miss my wife and children. Yet, I believe this to be true. It is an honor to suffer for Jesus Christ, as many have before me. My deepest thanks to all those around the world who are standing with and praying for me. Turkey should not get away with holding my father one more day. Please make any and all efforts to secure my father's release and safe return to the United States. He's been falsely imprisoned for far too long. Thank you.
And he still is imprisoned. I mean, that was an impassioned plea from his daughter. You heard from her live on the broadcast, but he's still in prison. So the UN is looking at this diplomatically, which is fine. We're working on that. But again, I want to go back to kind of let me eliminate some scenarios for you. There's not a realistic, there's no military option here. They're not going to send in a strike force to remove the pastor. It's just not reality. And Wes, so the force here is diplomatic force. It's not, you're not going to get a victory in the courtroom, although you have to prepare for it like you could, because it's world opinion here. We can't let him accuse him of terrorism when we know he's charged really with Christianization, which means what? He's a pastor of a church. But the reality is, this is not, I think it's important for people to understand, is not a military option here.
Absolutely not. Even though Turkey is an unreliable ally, even though they've violated the spirit and the expressed, policies of NATO, there is no military option. And interestingly enough, NATO has no provision for dismissing a member state who violates their charter and their values and their principles. But that does not mean that we cannot take action. There has been precedent in the past, both in Turkey and in Greece, when there was civil unrest, that NATO, took action to give sanctions against them, that kind of thing. I think that's what needs to happen. It's time to put our relationship with Turkey on the line. It's time for strong measures, and that includes verbal, diplomatic, and economic measures, not only by us, but by the other 27 members of NATO minus Turkey.
All right, so Than, what are the sanction measures moving through Congress?
Well, and actually, I'm glad Wes said that. It's got to be on a multilateral level. Senator Langford has a package of U.S.-based sanctions, mostly asset freezing, that he has pushed forward, and he is now, I'm pretty confident, in light of yesterday's trial, going to push for a floor vote on those. But Jay, even he will tell you that will not be effective because of how rich Turkey is, unless it's a multilateral effort. So they've got to feel isolated in the world is essentially where we're at, Jay. They have to realize that other nations are going to stand with the United States and defend our innocent pastor as well. So again, you start domestically, but you have to engage through the United Nations and through your diplomats around the world. And you need to have all your diplomats, by the way, in order for Turkey to feel that squeeze. And
we know that the situation with Turkey, we've talked about the changing environment and the difficulty in the region, but they are a powerhouse economy. Their GDP is $850 billion. They are a world economy.
It is. I've been to Turkey many times. It is, if you look at Istanbul, it's like a major European city. It's got 16 million inhabitants in it. Of course, if you go in the interior of Turkey, in Cappadocia, in the areas of what was known as Asia Minor, it's very rural, it's very agricultural, but it's a big producing country. It is, as we have always said, the bridge, or they like to think, the bridge between East and West. The problem is they are burning that bridge. Erdogan is destroying that nexus between East and West. And instead of moving toward the West, there is a definite trend moving toward the East and making it one of the chief Islamic nations of the world, instead of Ataturk's idea that it's a Western country.
So, Cece, let me ask you this, just from the scope of dealing with the lawyer that we have in Turkey, who's the family, and is a very brave lawyer, I have to say, number one, to even take on the representation. Because we know lawyers that we've worked with in Turkey, by the way, that have been picked up by the police and the security forces. We know that when we represented the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate, and their lawyer had been detained. So, I mean, these kind of things happen. But what is his sense of this case? I mean, I saw the press statement where he said we're going to win the trial, but what is his sense of what's going on here?
Right, and that was his sense going into it on the first day of the trial.
But we know that the whole thing is a sham. I mean,
absolutely.
I don't want people thinking that there's a reality on. They may if they find him not guilty, is because they want a way to get him back with quote showing we're an independent judiciary. Which, listen, I would take that as a win in any moment. I'd take it right now and say, great, ship him back to the United States with his wife. But that's not the reality on the ground unless they're doing it for political purposes. What is his sense?
And absolutely. He said from the beginning, this is a political case. It could go on for 2 to 10 years. That's how political cases go.
2 to 10 years. Go ahead.
Right. And but he's trying to change that narrative and say you need to try him in a fair trial. He's trying to say this is not a political case. You cannot treat it as a political case. He's an innocent pastor, and you need to let him go.
But, Andy, they're not going to – I mean, like I said, they'll find him not guilty if that's their way to say we have an independent judiciary. We told you that. We found him not guilty. We're shipping him back. But, this is not really a deliberative body in any sense of Western thought.
No, we can't think of it as an American court with an American trial and the due process and constitutional rights that we normally ascribe to a trial in a case. This is a political show trial. Erdogan has made it that. Erdogan has said, and we've heard it on this program, that he has said, you have a pastor, I have a pastor. You give me your pastor, I'll have a trial, and then I'll give you your... What do you mean I'll have a trial and then I'll give you your pastor? That's ridiculous. In other words,
be found guilty, and they'll say, we'd like to let him go, we can't.
But we can't.
Right.
That's right. So it's the height of hypocrisy, and that's what the Turkish government has degenerated into today.
Wes, you served in the military for a long time. Turkey, until the last probably 8 or 9 years, even 5 years ago, was considered a real ally of the United States and of Israel's.
Yes, one of our strongest allies. They took a stand against radical Islamists before Erdogan came to power. For years, when I was in the Army, to be stationed in Turkey was a big deal. Everyone wanted to be stationed there. It was that kind of a relationship, and that's simply not the case now.
We're going to be joined by our Director of Policy as well. Our entire panel is going to stay here. As I said, I want to say it again. You're not going to be probably hearing much about this case, and it's certainly not going to be in the media like it was until we get closer to the next trial date. But I want you to know that the ACLJ, our team's working really around the clock on this. CC Hall and her team are working around the clock on what is a very important case with dire consequences right now, and we want to see this pastor released. And it's going to take multilateral negotiations. We've got to, activate every resource, every asset we have to secure this pastor's release. We're going to do just that. We're going to continue to work on his behalf. When we come back from the break, we'll get a policy analyst's approach to this. We'll talk to our panel as well. Much more to come. And follow this at aclj.org or on social media.
There's been a very troubling development in the trial of Pastor Andrew Brunson in Turkey. As you know, Pastor Brunson's on trial facing charges of Christianization, on trial for simply living out his Christian faith. After hearing testimony, including accusations from unidentified and secret witnesses designed to discredit Pastor Brunson, the judge in the case said the trial would continue on May 7th and ordered Pastor Brunson to be taken back to prison. Instead of being returned to the prison where he had been held most recently, though, the judge ordered Pastor Brunson to be taken back to an extremely overcrowded prison where he was held initially. As you can imagine, the news is devastating to Pastor Brunson and his family. At the ACLJ, we're stepping up our aggressive campaign to secure the freedom of Pastor Brunson. Between now and the next court date of May 7th, we have a critical opportunity to turn up the pressure on the Turkish government. Add your name to our petition right now, aclj.org.
All right, welcome back, everybody, to the last segment of the broadcast here. And as I said, this is our final day of major coverage on this case that has garnered international attention. And as we've said, the ACLJ, our European Center for Law and Justice, are all working on this globally. I mean, this is to get this pastor released. Joining us right now in the studio, in addition to our senior military analyst and our senior counsel, Andy Economo, and our senior military analyst, Wes Smith, is our Director of Policy, Professor Harry Hutchinson. So, Professor Hutchinson, let me talk to you about this. Your sense of now day 3 of our coverage, but really we're reaching, I've said this is dire, but we're reaching also a critical crossroads. We have 3 weeks of witness prep. I mean, that's what's ahead here for a trial that's a show trial, a political show trial at best. But we got to present the evidence, because if you don't present the evidence, they're going to use that against the pastor. So we're in a very difficult spot in that sense. We can't we know it's a sham, but we can't acknowledge in the courtroom it's a sham, although the media around the world is, because we've got to put the evidence forward. But go ahead.
Well, we need to continue to place pressure on Turkey. It's important to note that the Brunson case takes place against an insidious history of anti-Christian bias. Turkey used to be a bridge between the West and the East. It is no longer the case, and so we need to consider sanctions, and other efforts to bring political pressure to bear on Turkey to advance this case.
So, Than, when we talk about sanctions, is there a reality, both domestically and internationally, that we're going to get anything through Congress? I mean, we need to.
Yeah, no, I think there is a reality, Jay, and I think that has to happen. But look, I also think it has to be combined with the attention of the world on it. Now, fortunately, the eyes of the world are on it. You have warned about how the next 3 weeks, a lot of that will wane. I think it is incumbent on our politicians to pass sanctions, to pass leverage. But here's the other thing, Jay, also to speak forcefully and loudly over those 3 weeks so that Turkey knows that they cannot do this except in the light of day. That is what will keep not only pressure on the rest of the world to invoke sanctions, but also the rest of the world understanding exactly what is happening here. And Jay, final point on this that the politicians need to make. When Erdogan says, give us our cleric, they need to respond with this: we don't have your cleric. He's a free man. You're the one imprisoning the pastor.
Well, that's exactly correct. And this again is part of the farce, Harry, of what they're trying to paint this portrait of. We needed this swap. First of all, I didn't even believe that they would do a swap. And we're not going to swap. How do you swap a person that's here legally in the United States? They brought an extradition charge against them. That is the Turkish government. It didn't even clear the first hurdle. So that's the reality of what's on the ground here.
Just as there is no credible evidence that Brunson has engaged in terrorism, there's no credible evidence that would support an extradition for Fethullah Gulen. So the Turkish case is extremely weak for trading Gulen for Brunson.
Yeah, I don't even think that. I mean, that's where it's the politics. I want to go back to the military issues. What is our military relationship, Wes, with Turkey right now? We used to be very close allies. They used to training and everything, military assets. They get a lot of assets, military equipment from the United States. What is our situation right now with Turkey?
Right. As a member of NATO, one of the things most people don't realize is NATO, all of their weapons and their weapon systems are interoperable. They do that on purpose so that they can defend each other, they can resupply one another. So we have supplied and armed Turkey for decades, and yet just recently, and I think this is very telling, Turkey, under the protest of the other NATO members, has agreed to buy a long-range S-400 missile system from Russia. And so it's time for NATO to stand shoulder to shoulder. NATO was formed to stand against the tyranny of the Soviet Union. Erdogan and Turkey are exhibiting the very things that NATO was founded to counter.
So, Andy, we look at that. I mean, the Russia-Turkey history had been very troubled for a long time, and now all of a sudden they're allies in a sense.
They are. Didn't we have a case in which there was a plane shot down?
Right.
And a foreign diplomat, I think a Russian diplomat, was killed, I think, in Turkey. And now suddenly they become the closest of allies because they have a common enemy, it seems to me, and that's the United States, because they are now being pushed together. And I think you have to look at the history of Russo-Turkish relationships to understand that these are strange bedfellows, but bedfellows indeed they are today, as Wes has pointed out.
So, Harry, when you look at this from a policy standpoint, what should the U.S. be doing? I'm going to get to Than on what's actually going to happen or what we think might happen, but what should the United States be doing, and what should our allies around the globe be doing on this case?
Well, one thing that we can do, which would place indirect pressure on Turkey, is to continue to place additional sanctions on Russia designed to break apart this alliance or emerging alliance between Putin and Erdogan. That is certainly something that we should consider. In addition, we should marshal all of our resources within the international community to continue to bring Brunson's case to the fore in terms of media and in terms of pursuing actions in the UN or in other international forums.
So, Than, your view, you're our designated representative to the United Nations. We've been aggressive on this. Do you sense any movement there?
I do. I think it's going to have to be the United States pushing them, Jay. I mean, the United States has led on this. They're going to have to engage in the allies. And I think the UN allies should engage in similar sanctions that the United States should, Jay. For instance, here is one. The United States could block Turkish officials from entering the United States really for any reason until this is resolved. That is something that the Appropriations Committee has put forward. I think they should do it. I think our allies should do it as well. I mean, just technically how this would work, Jay, here's one problem with that, though. You know who the official is responsible for making sure that a bar like that happens? It's the Secretary of State. So if you're going to pass that sanction, you have to have a Secretary of State in place to actually enforce it. So both those things have to happen together.
So, Senator, we're talking about the diplomatic in the United States. Senator Tillis was actually from North Carolina, was in the courtroom when this was going on. Pastor Brunson's from North Carolina. Here's what he said.
Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina was in court, and tonight he told us he was disappointed that Pastor Brunson wasn't released.
And I don't believe that justice was properly served.
So there you have it. And justice is not going to be served because it's not real. But I'm glad, I really appreciate Senator Tillis being there. But Andy, I call this a sham trial, but it's a sham trial where we don't have the luxury of not presenting the evidence because they will use the sham trial and no evidence against him.
That's right. I mean, you've got to put up a defense. American Center for Law and Justice, through our senior counsel, C.C. Heil, is coordinating that with over a dozen witnesses worldwide, putting them together for whatever good it is, but nonetheless, it has to serve some purpose. She's getting together the witnesses for when this trial resumes, whenever that may be. We don't know. We think it's in May, but as you pointed out, this is not a nation that is subject to due process or equal protection or constitutional protections that we in the United States are familiar with.
All right. Well, folks, that is going to do it for the broadcast on this. As I said, we're going to spend the next 3 weeks preparing these witnesses. Let me go quickly to Harry Hutchinson, literally 20 seconds here. Harry, when you look at this, bottom line, what do you think happens next? What should happen next?
Well, we have to continue to bring pressure to bear on Turkey, and we have to do it in the political, military, and other spheres because Turkey right now is not committed to the rule of law. They are committed to playing politics with human lives.
But they get military assets from the United States.
They do to the tune of billions of dollars. And what's at stake is not just American values, it's NATO values. We need to stand shoulder to shoulder.
We don't take military action against them, but we can stop getting them military equipment. And that, look, I think all options need to be on the table on this. Pray for this pastor. Pray for his family. Pray for our legal team that's working on this case. But I really want you praying for this pastor who's now back in this awful jail. We'll have more developments as it warrants. We'll talk to you tomorrow on the air.
There's been a very troubling development in the trial of Pastor Andrew Brunson in Turkey. As you know, Pastor Brunson's on trial facing charges of Christianization, on trial for simply living out his Christian faith. After hearing testimony, including accusations from unidentified and secret witnesses designed to discredit Pastor Brunson, the judge in the case said the trial would continue on May 7th and ordered Pastor Brunson to be taken back to prison. Instead of being returned to the prison where he had been held most recently, though, the judge ordered Pastor Brunson to be taken back to an extremely overcrowded prison where he was held initially. As you can imagine, the news is devastating to Pastor Brunson and his family. At the ACLJ, we're stepping up our aggressive campaign to secure the freedom of Pastor Brunson. Between now and the next court date of May 7th, we have a critical opportunity to turn up the pressure on the Turkish government. Add your name to our petition right now, aclj.org.